Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Today we are looking at Chapter 11, Section 4, and this section in particular has a lot of information, so I actually decided to split it into 2 days because it really kind of splits evenly. Because as you see, today we're looking at new nations in the Americas, and then the second half of that section will talk about how the United States gains Florida and some of the things that were done in response to what we'll talk about today. So our essential question for today is, what events brought about the rise and fall of democracy in Central and South America? As you can see, I've already done an audio recording of all of the sections of today's lesson, so you can use that, or you can stick along and keep using this video recording. That is up to you. So let's move on to the key terms. All right, for our key terms today, we're actually going to be looking at the first three of these terms because, like I said, I split the whole lesson into two parts. So we'll be learning about the Creoles, the Republic of Great Colombia, and the United Provinces of Central America. Tomorrow we'll look at the other two terms, but for today we'll really stick with Creole, Republic of Great Colombia, and United Provinces of Central America. So as we get started, I wanted to watch our first video. It's going to talk about one of the men that we will be learning about today, who had an immense impact on the growth and history of Central and South America. And that man is the great liberator, Mr. Simón Bolívar.
Yeah, we did see a statue of him in Colombia. And in Ecuador and Peru, too. So what's your point? Dear Tim and Moby, who is Simón Bolívar, and why is he such a big deal all over South America? Thanks, Lucy. Good question, Lucy. You too, Moby. Simón Bolívar led a series of South American revolutions against Spanish rule in the early 1800s. As a direct result of his skill as a writer, speaker, and military commander, Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Panama all won their independence from Spain. Yeah, he's like the George Washington of half of South America. In fact, Washington was one of his big heroes growing up. He was born to an aristocratic family in the Spanish colony of Venezuela in 1783. Like many wealthy South Americans, Bolívar was educated in Europe. In Spain, he studied the principles of the Enlightenment, the 18th century movement that saw human reason as the highest good. Enlightenment philosophers focused on revolutionary ideas like democracy and the rights of individuals. The American and French revolutions were inspired by these ideas. Bolívar believed that, like the American colonies, South America needed to throw off foreign rule. Well, it wasn't that Spain mistreated its colonies, but to Bolívar and many others, it was unfair for millions to be ruled by a distant king or queen. At the time, Spain had territories throughout the Caribbean, North America, Mexico, Central America, and South America. While traveling in Italy, Bolívar famously pledged never to rest until South America was free from Spanish oppression. He returned home at just the right time in 1807. Spain was busy fighting against French rule in the Peninsular War, and revolutionaries across South America decided they'd never have a better chance. Bolívar joined the Venezuelan resistance and quickly moved up its ranks. Recognizing his gift for speaking, resistance leaders sent him on a diplomatic mission to London in 1810. On his return, he delivered a stirring speech for Venezuelan independence in front of the National Congress. Well, Venezuela declared independence in 1811, but achieving that independence wasn't automatic. It would take another 9 years of intense fighting as control of Venezuela went back and forth between the revolutionaries and royalists who remained loyal to the Spanish crown. During this time, Bolivar became an officer in the Revolutionary Army. Whenever Spanish forces regained control, he fled to neighboring countries where he used his talent with the pen to gather allies and money. Well, like in 1812, he fled to Cartagena in the territory of New Granada, that's modern-day Colombia. In 1813, Bolivar returned to Venezuela, backed by military aid from New Granada. He was vastly outnumbered by Spanish forces in most battles, but he still managed to recapture Caracas, the capital city. Bolivar was hailed throughout Venezuela as El Libertador, or the Liberator. His victories piled up throughout Venezuela, New Granada, and what's now Ecuador, but the biggest came in 1819 at the Battle of Boyacá. It drove the Spanish out of New Granada and marked the beginning of the end of the Spanish Empire in South America. Over the next few years, the last of the Spanish forces in Venezuela and Ecuador were defeated. A new nation called Gran Colombia, made up of all the newly freed territories, was founded in 1821 with Bolivar as president. After meeting with a guy called José de San Martín, who had already liberated Argentina, Chile, and southern Peru, Bolivar marched his army into Peru and drove the remaining Spanish forces from the continent. With that, all of South America had finally achieved independence. In 1825, a new nation was created by the people of Upper Peru, and they named it Bolivia in Bolivar's honor. Well, Bolivar stuck to the principles of the Enlightenment his entire life, and he worked hard to establish a league of strong democratic governments throughout South America. But over the next few years, regional disputes, political rivalries, and civil wars shattered the unity Bolivar worked so hard to achieve. This eventually led to the breakup of Gran Colombia. Heartbroken, Bolivar resigned his presidency, and in 1830, he died of tuberculosis. Oh, so now you're impressed.
Welcome back. We were looking at a map of Latin America as it looked in 1800, and as we move around the map, you can see that a lot of it is controlled by Spain and Portugal. So compared to the small amount that became the United States from Great Britain, by 1800, a large part of the Western Hemisphere was controlled by Spain and Portugal, and there were still some Dutch, French, and British colonies, but for the most part, Spain. So the thing about revolutions, like we had the American Revolution a few years back, is that they're contagious. Ideas of liberty and freedom spread very quickly when people feel as though they are being mistreated. And in Latin America, by 1810, people were definitely being mistreated. Most people, even the very wealthy Creoles, and a Creole was a person born to two Spanish parents in Latin America. Even the very wealthy Creoles had very little say in their own local government. Spain kept a very tight grip on all of its colonies in Central and South America, but just like the English colonists had done in North America, Spanish colonists had growing desires to break away from the home country, in this case, to break away from Spain. And Spanish rule kept many people, especially Indians, in debt, and it got to the point that even the very wealthy wanted liberation from Spain. And it all starts with Mexico. In 1810, Father Miguel Hidalgo sparked a revolution in Mexico and was able to actually gain control of several Mexican provinces before his capture and execution in 1811. But the fight for Mexican independence didn't die with Hidalgo, but was carried on by another priest, Jose Morelos. And even though Morelos was eventually captured and executed, just like Father Hidalgo. Morelos wanted to give land to peasants and to commoners, so the wealthy Creoles opposed his idea. They wanted to keep the land for themselves. But eventually, more of the wealthy Creoles came around and joined the fight, and in 1821, it was a Creole-led force that eventually won control of Mexico. So 1821, Mexico wins its independence, and now it's on to the rest of Latin America. But before we do that, our next video is going to talk a little bit more about Mexican independence. So once we're done with that, we'll move south to the rest of Latin America.
The king's representatives in the New World, such as Altamirano Velasco, shown here, and Roman Catholic archbishops, let the Indians speak their own languages, and let native rulers govern their people. But the local population had to convert to Roman Catholicism wherever the Spanish gained military control. Moreover, corn and labor had to be given to the Spaniards instead of to the Aztecs. Corn and labor helped people of Spanish heritage in the New World, or Creoles, become a wealthy elite class. Indians were used as laborers on large estates, or haciendas, that many Creoles built. Life in the haciendas was markedly better than in the fields. Many Creole families lived in ornate splendor. But then, when the Spanish king, Charles III, took away many of their powers in the late 1700s, this elite class began talking about independence. In 1810, the talk turned into an open revolt. 11 years later, Mexicans found themselves citizens of an independent nation. By 1824, the new country had its first president, Guadalupe Victoria, and a newly adopted constitution.
We talked about him a few minutes back, but we're looking now at a picture of one of the most famous and most interesting characters, at least in my opinion, in South American history, and that is Mr. Simón Bolívar. And we're looking at him. He is shaking hands standing on the left, deciding the campaign to liberate South America. Bolivar was known as the Liberator and had come from a very wealthy Creole family in Venezuela, and at a very young age started fighting for Venezuelan independence. Bolivar had been angered at the harsh way that Spain was keeping control over Venezuela, even though Spain itself at this time was now under the control of Napoleon, or under the control of France. So you have France keeping a tight grip on Spain, and then Spain keeping a very tight grip on its colonies in the Western Hemisphere. And even though Bolivar had come from money, he rose to become a leader of rebel forces, and in 1819 led an army of rebel forces from Venezuela over the Andes Mountains into Colombia. And this surprised the Spanish forces that were living there, and he was able to defeat the Spanish forces and win independence for Venezuela. And soon after that, he was elected as the president of the Republic of Great Colombia. And the Republic of Great Colombia, we're looking at part of it. It takes up present-day Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama. And Bolivar, it wouldn't end there. He would continue to be a key figure in Latin America for years and years and even in decades to come. But what I want us to know about Bolivar, especially at this time period, is that he had come from a wealthy family in Venezuela, but at a very young age started fighting for Venezuelan independence and eventually won that independence for Venezuela and became the president of the Republic of Great Colombia. So other countries began emerging in Latin America throughout the early to mid 19th century. In 1816, Argentina was led to independence by José de San Martín, and in 1821, a section of Central America that we're looking at right here declared its independence from Spain and formed the United Provinces of Central America. And the United Provinces of Central America is present-day Nicaragua, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And one by one, Spain was losing its colonies in Latin America until only Puerto Rico and Cuba remained. And when Brazil demanded independence from Portugal, the son of the Portuguese king, Prince Pedro, joined their cause and ended up becoming the emperor of the new nation of Brazil. So he's known as Emperor Dom Pedro of Brazil. So this is what Latin America looked like in 1800, and by 1830, this is what it looks like. These new nations really tried to base their new constitutions on the United States Constitution, but there were some issues with that. The geography of the region made independence very, very difficult, and even more difficult than what the English colonists had experienced in the area that's now the United States. For one thing, the land area in Latin America is immense. I mean, look at this map. Look at Latin America compared to the United States in 1830 as far as the amount of land, and especially compared to this little tiny bit here that was the 13 original colonies. And if you know anything about the geography of South America, you know that running down the western part of South America, you have the Andes Mountains, which basically cuts Chile off from every other country. And another difference was that in the American colonies, there had been some experience with self-government, even while they were under England. Remember, we talked about them having governors and town meetings and so on. But the Spanish colonies had no experience. Spain had kept a very tight grip on the colonies and allowed even the very wealthy very little say in government. So when the colonies declared independence, they really didn't have any experience to really be able to draw from. And unfortunately, this lack of experience combined with the huge geographical areas led many of these young democratic nations to end up falling to dictatorships, which, if you remember, is one of the things that the framers of the Constitution really wanted to try and avoid when setting up the republic. So it was able to be avoided in the United States, but not so much in Central and South America. So to sum it all up, these new nations in Latin America formed and built their constitutions kind of based on the United States Constitution. But the geography of Central and South America made independence very difficult. I mean, we saw the maps. The land is immense. While the American colonies had some experience in self-government, the Spanish colonies really did not. So as a result, most ended up falling to dictators in the end, much like the Roman Republic that we talked about in Chapter 7. Which brings us to our assignment for today. Now, there is no written assignment with today's lesson because, like I said, it's split into two parts. But you will be responsible for this information on the upcoming Chapter 11 test. Now, tomorrow we're going to continue our discussion of Chapter 11, Section 4, but we're going to focus more on how the United States acquired Florida, as well as the Monroe Doctrine, which came out of this and kind of changed U.S. foreign policy. And a lot of that was in response to these new nations gaining their independence. So it's all going to tie together. But until tomorrow, I will see you later.